Lucille O'Neill was just trying to get home when flashing lights changed everything. A routine stop becomes a silent battlefield, and the officer doesn't know he just challenged the mother of a giant. Big Shaq hears the call no son ever wants. Respect wasn't given, but a storm is about to demand it. Some names don't need to be shouted. They change everything just by being spoken. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. She was just trying to get home. A church bag on the passenger seat, and gospel still playing low, when the sirens hit. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the Georgia backroad, where trees stood like silent sentinels. Lucille O'Neill, dignified and composed, eased her car to the shoulder, her hands steady on the wheel. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror pulsed like a warning, but she remained calm, her posture upright, her gaze forward. The officer approached with a measured stride, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He tapped the window, and Lucille lowered it, greeting him with a polite nod. "Afternoon, officer," she said, her voice smooth, carrying the weight of years lived with grace. "License and registration," he replied, his tone clipped, eyes scanning the interior before settling on her face. She handed over the documents without hesitation, her fingers steady, her demeanor unflinching. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his gaze narrowing. "I'm not sure, sir," Lucille responded, maintaining eye contact. "You were swerving," he stated, though the road had been straight and empty. Lucille knew better than to argue. She simply nodded, allowing the silence to stretch. The officer returned to his cruiser, leaving Lucille in the stillness of the roadside. The gospel music continued to play softly, a comforting presence in the tense atmosphere. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her own reflection, calm, composed, unyielding. Inside the patrol car, the officer radioed in the license information. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Running a check on a Lucille O'Neill, Georgia license plate." His voice trailed off as he awaited a response. A moment later the dispatcher replied, her voice tinged with recognition. "Unit 12. Did you say Lucille O'Neill?" "Affirmative," he confirmed. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher continued. "Stand by, Unit 12. The line went silent, leaving the officer frowning at the radio. Back in her car, Lucille remained still, her hands resting on her lap. She glanced at the side mirror, watching the officer in his vehicle, his posture tense, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed before he returned, his demeanor slightly altered. "Everything checks out," he said, handing back her documents. "Drive safely." Lucille accepted her license and registration, offering a polite smile. "Thank you, officer." As she merged back onto the road, the gospel music swelled, the lyrics resonating with a newfound depth. The encounter had been brief, yet it lingered, a reminder of the subtle biases that pervaded everyday life. Unbeknownst to Lucille, the dispatcher had recognized her name, her voice tinged with familiarity. She reached for her phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in years.
"Hello?" A deep voice answered.
"Shaquille," she said, her tone urgent. "Your mother was just pulled over." There was a pause, then a measured response. "Is she okay?" "Yes, but the officer didn't recognize her." "I thought you should know." "Thank you," Shaquille replied, his voice steady. "I'll take care of it." Lucille continued her drive, unaware of the call, her thoughts focused on the road ahead. The incident was a stark reminder of the world she navigated daily, a world where respect was not always given, regardless of one's dignity or grace. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the landscape, Lucille's resolve remained unshaken. She had faced adversity before, and would continue to do so with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime. The road stretched out before her, winding through the Georgia countryside, each mile a testament to her resilience. The gospel music played on, a soundtrack to her journey, a reminder that faith and fortitude would guide her through whatever lay ahead. See, the thing about names, some of them carry more than just syllables, they carry storms. Names like Lucille O'Neill aren't spoken, they're felt, not because of the spotlight they eventually catch, but because of the shadows they first survived. Long before her son became the man people now call Big Shaq, Lucille had earned her own kind of weight in the world, not with fame, but with fire she carried inside her bones, the kind forged in Sunday morning pews and Wednesday night shifts that didn't care how tired a black woman might be. As she drove down the road again, her grip steady on the steering wheel, The weight of the traffic stop still hung in the air like stale perfume. She hadn't flinched when the officer raised his voice, hadn't begged or explained. She just sat in silence, calm and measured, like a woman who knew this wasn't the first time someone would try to reduce her to nothing. And it wouldn't be the last. Lucille's mind drifted, pulled backward to another time, another stop, not with flashing lights, but one just as sharp. It was 1974, and she'd been walking home from her job at the hospital, wearing white shoes that pinched and a dress that smelled like cafeteria steam and cleaning supplies. She was just 23 then, invisible and overworked, waiting at a bus stop when two white men in suits walked by and clutched their briefcases tighter like her presence was a threat. She hadn't said a word, just sat there, arms folded across her chest, staring at the silence, the suspicion. It felt familiar even now. She remembered raising Shaquille in the rough parts of Newark. Before the cameras, before the endorsements, before the millions. She taught him how to walk proud but not loud, how to speak truth but never provoke, not because she didn't believe in courage, but because she understood consequence. She taught him that kindness wasn't weakness, and humility wasn't submission, that their survival depended not just on strength, but on grace. And yet here she was again, 60-something years old, pulled over on a quiet road for doing absolutely nothing. Her car was clean, her tags were current, her seatbelt buckled, and yet somehow, she'd still been the one stopped, the one doubted, the one studied. Lucille turned the radio knob slightly, letting the gospel hum fade to a murmur. She didn't need the music right now. She needed the quiet to think. Then she saw it. In the rearview mirror, another set of flashing lights pulling up behind her. A second cruiser. Her heart didn't pound. No panic rushed in. She just exhaled, long and low, the way you do when you've been through this before. Because if there's one thing the years taught her, it's that the real weight of being a black mother in America isn't just raising your children right. It's surviving long enough to see them grow. The second officer stepped out, older, worn around the edges, with a slower gait and a look in his eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his fair share. He walked up to the first cop, pulled him aside, and began whispering. Lucille couldn't hear the words, but she saw the shift in posture. The younger cop stiffened, jaw clenched, arms crossed. That's when she felt it. The subtle chill of recognition forming, not in the officer's voice, but in his behavior. The first one didn't say much now. He kept glancing back at her, then toward his superior. A whisper traveled faster than sirens. Lucille sat still, refusing to touch her phone. She wasn't calling anyone. Not Shaquille. Not the lawyer she'd had on speed dial since the early 2000s. She wasn't going to make it easier for them to say, now we know who you are. Because that's the problem with names that come with fame. People only respect them when they're useful. But Lucille didn't want their respect because of who her son was. She wanted it because of who she was, and had always been. Her thoughts flickered again. Back to the days when Shaq was just a boy. Back when food stamps didn't stretch far enough, and her pride wouldn't let her complain. Back when he was the tallest child in the classroom. And already learning that size didn't shield you from suspicion. She remembered the day she had to explain to him why the store clerk followed them down every aisle. He was only 9 then. Confused. Hurt. She didn't have the heart to sugarcoat it, so she told the truth. Some people don't need a reason to fear us, baby. They just need a glimpse. That was the beginning. The moment she knew she was raising a boy, the world would one day try to shrink, control or fear, and she decided that day she would teach him how to walk through that fire, and not burn. The second officer now approached her window slowly, hands visible, voice low. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry for the delay. There seems to be a misunderstanding. Are you all right?" Lucille turned her head. Her stare was cool and patient. "I'm fine," she said, pausing just long enough to let the weight settle. "I was always fine." The officer gave a small nod, the kind that says more than it should. "You're free to go. We appreciate your patience." She looked at him carefully. Not because she wanted to thank him, but because she wanted him to see the difference between courtesy and dignity. Courtesy can be taught, dignity must be earned. As she rolled up her window and put the car in drive, Lucille saw something strange in her rear view. The younger cop stood stiffly at the front of his cruiser, face pale, as if the name had finally clicked. As if somewhere in his mind the dots had started to connect, maybe from a headline or a commercial, or a sports documentary his father used to watch. The realization didn't bring him shame yet, but confusion, the kind that comes when a man's illusions are starting to peel. Lucille drove off without glancing back. She didn't need to see their faces. She'd seen enough of that expression in her life. The sudden shift from indifference to discomfort. When power meets the realization that it's been mishandled. When authority is forced to reckon with humility. She'd seen it in mirrors, in store managers, in gas station attendants, in bank clerks who weren't sure about the ID. It always looked the same, and it always came too late. The Georgia trees zipped past in her peripheral, tall and swaying, like they were whispering affirmations. Only she could hear. The air smelled like sun and soil, and something older than both. Truth. She tapped her fingers gently on the steering wheel, remembering a time when she'd feared this road, not for what might happen, but for how often nothing did. No justice, no apology, no explanation, just silence, and a sour aftertaste. She had driven down 1,000 roads like this, and every time she walked away the same woman, unbroken. And still she hadn't said her son's name, not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't need to use him as a shield. She was enough. Her story was enough. Her life long before the cameras and the crowds was enough. That's the thing people don't get about women like Lucille. They don't need the armor of men. They build men. They raise giants, not for glory but for survival. And when the world tries to erase them, they don't scream. They endure. As the road straightened and the city skyline crept up in the distance, Lucille eased back in her seat and finally let the gospel swell again. The lyrics floated through the car like prayer and memory. Her phone buzzed, once, and she saw the name flash across the screen. Shaq. She didn't answer yet. She just smiled. Quiet, full, and kept driving. Because sometimes the greatest power isn't in being known. It's in knowing exactly who you are. When the voice on the radio cracked, so did the atmosphere. It was a split-second break in protocol, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that shifts air. Inside the county dispatch center, a modest square building tucked behind the police department, the static-laced call came in ordinary as ever. A routine traffic stop on Route 48, mid-afternoon. One vehicle, no backup requested. But then the officer said a name. Lucille O'Neill. Georgia license, 06 Alpha. The headset perched on Yvette Rollins' ear, buzzed softly, but it wasn't the line noise that made her sit up straight. It was the name. A name she hadn't heard in years. Not in person anyway. Not since her nephew had once proudly pointed to a towering figure on the TV screen and said, "That's Big Shaq. That's the son of Miss Lucille from the old neighborhood." The kind of name that stuck with you. The kind of name that carried memory and might, not because of celebrity, but because of character. Yvette blinked, eyes narrowing at the screen where the information pulled in. She read it twice, then once more. Lucille O'Neill, age 72. Vehicle registered in her name. No outstanding tickets. No alerts. Completely clean. She reached forward, pressing the transmit button on the console. Unit 12. Confirm name. Did you say Lucille O'Neill? There was a brief pause. Then a cold, professional voice replied. Confirmed. Just running her through. Stand by. Yvette let go of the button and leaned back, a slow storm brewing behind her quiet eyes. She knew that tone. The kind officers used when they'd already made up their minds. The kind that said, "I don't care who you are. I'm in control now." And it made her stomach tighten. Behind her, chatter filled the dispatch room. Other calls, other radios, other emergencies. But none of it registered. She tapped her fingers lightly on the desk, then leaned in again, this time lowering her voice on the private channel, reserved for intra-department communication. Unit 12, she said slowly. You may want to double-check the name you've got. That's Lucille O'Neill, as in Shaquille's mama. Another beat of silence. Then, stiffly, copy. Proceeding with the stop. Yvette blinked. Proceeding? With what? The woman's record was clean. No erratic driving reported. And she wasn't combative. Yvette could tell from the officer's tone. So what, exactly, was he proceeding with? She turned to her partner across the row, a gray-bearded man named Curtis, who'd been dispatching even longer than she had. You hear that name? She asked, voice low. He nodded, already keying into the situation. You think he knows? No, she said. That's the problem. Curtis glanced toward the big screen monitor, where GPS locations showed all active patrol cars in the area. Unit 12's cruiser was lit up, just off the main road, with another now arriving, a senior officer en route, presumably for oversight. That brought Yvette the faintest relief, but still, something in her gut tugged hard. She leaned back toward her mic. Unit 12. Do you require additional assistance? No, came the curt reply. All under control. That was a lie. Not the kind the public hears, but the kind dispatchers live with. The denial of tension. Yvette muted her mic and muttered, he doesn't know who he's dealing with. And not just because of her son. Because it wasn't just about Shaq. It was about Lucille herself, a woman who decades before her name was tied to fame, used to volunteer at food banks, organize voter registration drives in the South, and tutor local kids in reading at the church basement. Yvette remembered her even then, a woman who carried herself like a walking psalm, gentle but unshakable. The kind of woman whose dignity came from before the headlines. She typed a note into the system. Alert. Identity confirmation. High-profile civilian. Exercise discretion. It was a protocol message. Formal. Contained, professional. But her fingers hovered as she typed it. This wasn't just formality. This was protection. Because she'd seen what could happen when things escalated for no reason other than pride. And she'd lived through enough routine stops that turned into community flashpoints. She checked the timestamps. 10 minutes had passed since the initial stop. Too long for a clean release. Something was off. At the same time, on a social media dashboard 2 rooms over, another kind of alert was brewing. A younger dispatcher named Drew, barely 2 years into the job, and assigned to monitor public traffic data, caught movement on the trending tab. A short, shaky video had just been posted by a driver passing through the same route. It showed a still frame of Lucille's car, 2 officers outside it, and a timestamp that matched the stop exactly. The caption read, "Why they got an old lady pulled over for 20 mins in the heat. This don't feel right." No names were mentioned. No faces clearly shown. But the angle caught just enough of Lucille's profile. Her signature short silver curls, her pressed blouse, her composed posture in the driver's seat. Drew didn't know who she was. But someone in the comments did. Wait, is that Shaq's mom? And then another. That is Lucille O'Neill. This is wild. Yvette's phone buzzed on her desk. A text from her niece popped up. Auntie, is something going down with Shaq's mom? Twitter is blowing up. Yvette stared at the screen. It had begun. Lucille's identity was no longer private. The internet had picked it up, and while that meant she might now be shielded by visibility, it also meant the officers on that scene were suddenly under a microscope. She looked over at Curtis again. It's spreading, she said. Of course it is, he replied. That woman's name carries gravity. Back on the radio, Unit 12's transmission returned, quieter now, with a hitch in the voice. We've concluded the stop. Vehicle released. No citations. Yvette didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang, not out of disrespect, but to let the officer feel the weight of that pause. When she finally keyed back in, her tone was neutral. Copy that, Unit 12. Incident closed. But behind the mic, her face told a different story. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because this wasn't just about a mistaken identity, or a prolonged stop. This was about a culture that still hadn't learned the difference between lawful authority and quiet oppression. It was about the thin line between enforcement and profiling, and it was about a mother, someone who'd carried the burden of being black in America long before her son carried a basketball. That night, the video hit national news. Not because there was violence. There wasn't. Not because someone shouted, no one did. But because of what almost happened. Because of what always could happen. And because Lucille never had to say a word for the world to understand something had been wrong. Yvette stayed late that evening, reading the flood of messages, watching as public opinion built up like a wave. Most didn't know her name. They wouldn't recognize her face in the grocery store. But in that dispatch chair, headset on, fingers still hovering over the mic, Yvette Rollins had done what she always did. Listened, processed, and watched carefully when power got reckless. And in doing so, she'd made sure one name wasn't forgotten. Not because it was famous, but because it never should have been ignored in the first place. No, nothing like that. Just attitude. That look. The tone. You know the one. He did. He'd seen it directed at his uncles. At himself. At his coaches. He'd seen it in bank lobbies, and boutique stores, and restaurants that forgot they had tables available. That shade of arrogance, masked as procedure, born from the idea that dignity is optional when you're black. I'm coming down, he said flatly. Shaq Bryn started. but he'd already ended the call. He looked around the gym. Zaylin had gone back to the group. The rest of the kids were laughing again, still caught in the glow of a regular afternoon. And for a second Shaq let himself look at them, not as future athletes or future scholars, but as future targets, future suspects in someone's mind. He turned toward the office and ducked in, grabbing his keys off the desk. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Nadine, followed him in with concern trailing her. "Everything okay?" "My mama," he said, pulling on a hoodie. "She got stopped. Georgia PD. Nadine blinked. "They know who she is?" "No. And she ain't gonna tell him." "Why?" He looked up, eyes dark but calm. "Because she doesn't need to be someone's mother to deserve respect." He didn't run out of the building. He didn't slam doors or shout. He moved the way only someone massive and sure could, like a wall had just started shifting. Within minutes, he was in a black SUV, phone already back in hand, texting contacts, not reporters, not lawyers, people in the background who could move quietly, with precision. A retired sergeant from Atlanta PD, a civil rights advocate who'd worked on bias training reform, a woman from a broadcast network who owed him a favor. This wasn't rage. It was action. Slow, deliberate, strategic. The kind of momentum built not with fists but with reach. By the time he hit I-78, he was already in motion. Not heading straight to Georgia. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what had happened, how it had unfolded, who the officers were, what was on the body cam, if it was rolling, whether the department would bury the footage or not. He sent one last message to a family friend, a media consultant who specialized in timing. "Don't leak anything yet. Just watch it. Watch it spread." In the passenger seat, his phone buzzed again. A text from Bryn. "She's home now. Didn't say a word about it. Just told the neighbor she needed to get dinner started." Shaq exhaled. Of course she did. He thought about the last time they'd talked, 2 nights ago. She'd asked about his ankle, told him he needed to stop favoring his left leg, like an old man, and then reminded him about the church donation deadline coming up. She hadn't said much about the world. She rarely did, but he knew her silences, knew what lived inside them. He remembered something else too. He was 10, and they were in the checkout line at the corner store. The clerk, a wiry man with hollow eyes, had accused her of hiding a can of formula in her purse, loud enough for other customers to hear. She hadn't flinched then either. She'd opened the purse calmly, shown the contents and said, "Now check the receipt again." Afterward, he'd asked her why she didn't scream, why she didn't slap the man or storm out. "Because, baby," she'd said, "my rage doesn't belong to him. It belongs to you. I save it to protect your peace." He never forgot that, and that was why this wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about someone famous getting mistreated. It was about a woman who taught him that silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom sharpened to a fine edge. He dialed her. It rang once, twice. She answered on the third. "Hey, baby." "Boy, you good?" "I'm good," she said. "Just cooking." "You all right?" I said I'm good. A pause. "It's already out there, huh?" "Yeah. I didn't tell them who I was." "I know." "Why not?" "Because if I have to be somebody's mama for them to treat me right, we already lost." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'm handling it."
I know you are.
"Ma?" "Yes, baby. I love you." "I know that too. Now don't let this become bigger than it has to be. I've been black and polite longer than they've been alive. Let that sit with you a minute." He smiled. "Just a little. Still gonna move the board. I expect nothing less." She hung up first, as always. Shaq stared out the windshield, the highway stretching ahead like a promise and a threat. The storm was coming, not the violent kind, not the kind with broken glass and sirens, but the kind that builds slowly, with whispers and posts and sideways glances, the kind that makes people in power look over their shoulders. He wasn't going to issue a statement. Not yet. He wasn't going to post an angry video. That wasn't how his mama taught him. But he would make sure the silence ended where it needed to. Because now it wasn't just about her. It was about every woman like her. Every elder who'd ever been dismissed. Every matriarch who'd had to bear her own name alone because no one knew who her son was. He was Shaquille O'Neal. But more than that, he was Lucille's son. And in this moment, there was no title more powerful than that. In the age of lenses, silence is a lie that can't hide long. No matter how subtle the disrespect or polished the protocol, there's always an eye watching, always a lens recording, Always someone pressing post with a thumb that doesn't shake. And that afternoon, on a stretch of Georgia road slick with heat waves and silence, a 21-year-old journalism major named Raina James became that eye. Raina hadn't meant to get involved. She was headed back from her internship at the local station, playlist humming low through her speakers, when she spotted the two patrol cars on the shoulder. Something about the scene made her ease up on the gas. Maybe it was the way the older black woman sat. Not afraid, not angry, just still, like she'd seen this too many times to react. Or maybe it was the way the younger white officer leaned in, too close, like he wasn't asking questions anymore but trying to assert something else. Raina had seen that posture before, in old news footage, in documentaries she'd studied, in her own high school principal's office, when her cousin was suspended for disrespect that was really just volume and presence. She pulled over a safe distance back, angling her phone just above the steering wheel, and hit record. No commentary, no zooming, just a steady frame, a document. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from focus. Journalism wasn't about opinion, she'd learned. It was about capturing what others pretended not to see. From her car, she couldn't hear the exact words, but body language speaks louder than audio. The officer's stance was rigid, his gestures too firm for someone speaking to a woman who looked old enough to be his grandmother. The older woman's hand stayed in her lap, her back never curled. She answered with minimal movement, chin high, mouth quiet. That too, Raina, was the story. The asymmetry of power, the patience of someone who'd endured this long before hashtags were invented. She let the camera roll. It was supposed to be a 30-second clip, maybe a minute. Something she could turn in to her ethics professor for her street reporting project. But something about it wouldn't let her stop filming. So she sat there for nearly 12 minutes watching the second officer arrive, watching the first one argue, watching something shift in the air. She caught the slow exchange of words, the eventual return of ID, the second cruiser driving away first. Then finally, the woman easing her car back onto the road like nothing had happened. Raina lowered the phone but didn't move. Her gut twisted. It wasn't dramatic. No one had shouted. No guns drawn. No cuffs. But it still felt wrong, like someone had tried to shrink a woman who'd refused to fold. She got home to her tiny apartment, tucked behind a row of fast food joints and closed-down gas stations. Her laptop was still warm from the morning's uploads. She didn't do much editing, didn't even add a caption beyond a quiet thought typed into the post bar. She said nothing, and that's what said everything. She hit post at 4:11 p.m. Just another post on a platform flooded with louder moments, bigger injustices, angrier voices. She didn't expect much, maybe a few shares, a comment or two. She was wrong. By 5:02 p.m., the video had been reposted over 1,000 times. By 5:47, someone in the comments section typed 4 words that cracked everything wide open. Wait, is that Lucille O'Neal? At first, Raina thought it was a joke. The Lucille O'Neal, as in Shaquille's mom? But then more people joined in, comparing screenshots to old interviews, linking to her nonprofit work, finding photos of Lucille at church events and charity drives. The collective internet, in all its reckless brilliance, had identified her. Now the video wasn't just about a disrespectful stop, it was about who had been stopped, and why even that hadn't earned basic dignity.
News blogs picked it up next. A regional journalist messaged Raina, asking if they could credit her. Then a political commentator reshared it with the line, "So this is what we do to women who raised legends."
Raina watched it all unfold from her couch, phone buzzing like a slot machine. Her name was starting to attach to the post. Not just as a witness, but as a whistleblower. By evening, her inbox had filled with requests, interviews, panel invites, commentary slots. Her voicemail overflowed. A producer from a syndicated news magazine show left a message saying, "We're covering the systemic angle. We'd like to get your lens on the moment." She stared at the phone in disbelief. She hadn't said a word in the video. She hadn't even stepped out of her car. But somehow the stillness of what she caught was louder than any protest chant. Somewhere deep down, Raina knew this was bigger than she was ready for. She'd seen the way people who captured truth got dragged, how they got accused of exaggerating, of editing, of having an agenda. But she also knew this. She hadn't made anything up. The lens didn't lie. It just exposed what people weren't willing to say out loud. By 9:15 p.m., the precinct had issued a quiet, almost clinical statement. A traffic stop involving Lucille O'Neal occurred earlier today. No citation was issued. The department is reviewing footage and protocol compliance. That sentence was the digital equivalent of a shrug. But the people weren't shrugging. Comments flooded timelines. Tweets exploded. Celebrities chimed in, including retired athletes and former colleagues of Shaq. One tweet from a legendary sports anchor simply read, "You don't touch Lucille, period." That one alone gathered 80,000 likes in 2 hours. What made the video go viral wasn't just the injustice, it was the restraint, the way Lucille never raised her voice, the way the cop's tone stayed right at the edge of abuse, without ever crossing the legal line, the way it all looked so normal, and that normalcy felt like the real crime. Raina finally turned off her notifications and sat in the dark, phone face down on the table, laptop screen glowing with retweets and hashtags. She wasn't sure what came next. She hadn't done this to become known. She'd done it because something inside her whispered, "This is what you're studying for." Journalism wasn't about proximity to power. It was about accountability, about making sure the quiet ones didn't go unseen. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to stay out of the story, she'd stepped right into the middle of it. And somewhere across the country, in a quiet house in Georgia, Lucille sat at her kitchen table, gently folding a napkin, her phone on silent as the country whispered her name louder than ever. She hadn't asked for this, but it had found her, and the camera had never blinked. He thought he was in control, until the crowd outside the precinct started growing. Officer Grant Wilmer sat stiffly in the corner of the squad briefing room, scrolling through body cam footage he'd already seen twice, the familiar clips bouncing in his mind like static. He wasn't watching to learn anything new, he was watching to reassure himself, to remind himself that he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't used force, hadn't broken policy, because policy was his shield. As long as he followed the handbook, the morality of his actions didn't need to be questioned, or so he believed. The noise started small, a faint hum beneath the midday heat. By 11 a.m., it was more than noise. It was presence. People were standing outside the station now, not screaming, not waving signs yet, but waiting. Some leaned against their cars, some paced, some just stared at the brick walls like they expected answers to walk out on their own. The dispatch center picked up the chatter first. Local activists tweeting about the incident, then student groups retweeting Raina's video, with captions like, "Our mothers are not traffic stops." By lunchtime, 2 more churches had shared the post. Then an HBCU professor, then a pastor from a county over. The hashtags weren't rage-fueled. They were clear, quiet, purposeful, and somehow, that made them more dangerous to men like Grant, who'd spent years believing the absence of chaos meant the presence of order. He wasn't even in uniform anymore. Command had told him to change into plain clothes until the situation cooled. Not suspended, not reprimanded, just standing down. The phrase echoed in his mind like a taunt. Captain Morris entered the room, his face unreadable, but steps heavier than usual. He handed Grant a printout of the precinct's public statement. 2 bland paragraphs with no real stance, no apology, no name. Grant scanned it. "Why aren't we clarifying who she is?" he asked, more annoyed than concerned. "Because it's too late for clarifying," Morris replied, arms crossed. "At this point, anything we say is going to sound like spin. But I didn't do anything wrong. Her record was clean. I was polite. You were compliant. There's a difference." The captain leaned forward. "This woman didn't need your suspicion. She needed your respect. You didn't offer that." Grant looked away, jaw twitching. "So now we base law enforcement on feelings?" "No. But if you think this job is about law alone, then you've been wearing that badge for the wrong reasons." Outside, the noise shifted again, a rhythm starting, slow and steady. A beat, a cadence, hands clapping in unison, a voice through a megaphone that wasn't shouting, just speaking with certainty. "You don't need to kneel on someone's neck to suffocate dignity." The words hit harder than the squad room's AC. Grant stood up, pacing toward the blinds. He peeked through. What he saw wasn't a mob. It was a message. Families, students, elders in lawn chairs. Some wore shirts that read "Lucille is all of us." Others held photos not of Lucille herself, but of their own mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. "Who is she?" Grant finally asked, voice sharper now, like he was bracing for something he didn't want to hear. Captain Morris didn't answer right away. He just turned toward the door. "Google it." That sentence stuck like a splinter. Grant pulled out his phone, hesitated, then typed, Lucille O'Neill. It took half a second. The first image that popped up was a formal headshot. Silver curls, warm eyes, expression steady. A biography underneath. Author, advocate, mother of Shaquille O'Neal. Then article after article about scholarships, charity work, keynote speeches, hospital fundraisers, and deeper still, archived footage of her marching for educational equity in the early 90s, testifying before local boards about school lunch programs, talking about raising her children with discipline and faith while working double shifts. He blinked, then scrolled again, then stopped. A video had just gone up. Not from Raina, but from a national sports outlet. A former teammate of Shaq's had posted a tribute reel of Lucille through the years, hugging soldiers on USO tours, greeting cancer patients, speaking at a juvenile justice forum. The caption beneath read simply, "You pulled over Grace." Grant set his phone down slowly. It wasn't that he was embarrassed for not recognizing her. It was that somewhere deep down, he'd sensed there was something different about that stop. Something unnerving about how unbothered she'd been. How she didn't panic, didn't argue, didn't try to use her name as a defense. It had rattled him. Not because she was defiant, but because she wasn't. She had looked at him like she'd already lived through him 100 times. The door opened behind him. Officer Delaney stepped in, tablet in hand. "We've got 3 interviews requests pending. National outlets. They want to know if we're going to issue a direct apology, or just keep hiding behind procedure." Grant turned. "Apologize? For what? I didn't detain her. I didn't yell. I did my job." Delaney raised an eyebrow. "Then why are we the ones under the spotlight while she's at home quiet?" "Because the silence that follows dignity is louder than any argument." By 3:30 p.m., a third crowd had gathered, not just outside the station, but around City Hall. The mayor hadn't made a statement. The police commissioner hadn't answered press calls. And Lucille, she still hadn't said a word. But Shaq had. A quiet video message posted to his official channels. No background music, no branding, just him, sitting in a wooden chair, hands folded in front of him. "You don't need to fear my mama to respect her. You don't need to know who she raised, to know she deserved better. Some folks only care when the name's familiar. But Black dignity doesn't depend on celebrity, it depends on conscience, and I hope to God we haven't lost ours." The clip was 58 seconds long. It had 1.2 million views by sunset. In the squad room, the TV was turned to mute, but the headline scroll across the bottom was loud enough. "National outrage over traffic stop of Lucille O'Neill builds." Grant leaned back against the wall, something cold spreading through his chest. Not panic, not guilt, just the slow ache of recognition. He hadn't been violent. He hadn't been overtly rude. But that was the problem. The mistake wasn't in the act. It was in the attitude. The subtle way his authority had come first, and her humanity second. The quiet assumption that she needed to prove herself worthy of his respect. The same assumption that had fueled 1,000 other stories just like this, except most didn't end with the world watching. He closed his eyes, the room still spinning. Outside, the crowd hadn't dispersed. They'd grown more focused. The chants were still calm, the signs still respectful, but the pressure was real. Not the pressure of threat, but of truth. Captain Morris re-entered the room. Arms crossed again. "City's asking questions now. Commissioners meeting with the board. This ain't going away. Grant, you better decide what side of the story you want to be on." He nodded, slowly. For the first time since the stop, his voice dropped. "I didn't see her." Morris paused. He looked at her. "No," Grant said again. "I didn't see her." And for the first time in his career, the badge on his chest felt heavier than the vest ever had. He stood there quietly, watching the monitors, listening to the distant hum of footsteps and voices outside the building, not angry, not wild, just insistent, present, and getting louder. He didn't come with cameras. He came with a presence the room wasn't ready for. The precinct lobby had settled into an uneasy stillness that afternoon, the kind that comes when the eye of the storm moves directly overhead. Outside, 100 voices murmured beneath umbrellas and placards, the air dense with late summer humidity and quiet expectation. The media vans were down the block, their lenses pointed, their anchors poised, but inside the building, no one was moving fast. Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the front doors alone. No fanfare, no flash, just him, 6'11", broad-shouldered, wrapped in a plain black hoodie and jeans. The hood down, head held high, steps slow but deliberate. His face didn't carry heat, but something heavier, something steadier, the kind of gravity that doesn't demand respect, but forces it. The front desk officer looked up and immediately froze, mouth parting as if to speak. Then, thinking better of it, Shaq said nothing. He simply nodded once, then moved past the turnstile. Nobody stopped him. There are some people who move in silence so large it clears the room before a word is spoken. Down the hallway, officers leaned out of rooms, some startled, others shrinking back. But Shaq wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for one person, and he knew exactly where to find him. Grant Wilmer sat alone in a back office, the blinds half drawn, the clock ticking louder than his thoughts. His uniform shirt hung on a hook behind the door. He was in a white undershirt now, elbows on the desk, phone beside him, untouched. A bottle of water sat half empty. Sweat crept along his hairline. Though the AC was running strong, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her eyes. Lucille's, the way they hadn't begged, or pleaded, or even pushed back. They'd just seen him, like she knew something about him. He didn't know yet. Then the knock came. 3 soft taps, heavy knuckles against hollow wood. Grant turned, startled. He stood halfway up before the door even opened. Shaq ducked slightly through the frame and entered. Not looming. Just being. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle. Let the weight of the moment find its own legs. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came. Just a short breath. Then another. "I'm not here to yell," Shaq said finally, voice deep but calm. "I'm not here to film you. I'm not here to shame you." Grant swallowed. "I didn't know who she was." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "You shouldn't have had to." The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Shaq stepped forward, just enough to close the space without crowding it. "You saw a black woman in a nice car, and you made her explain herself. And when she didn't rush, when she didn't panic, that made you uncomfortable." Grant looked away, jaw clenched. "I followed protocol." Shaq didn't nod. He didn't argue. He simply asked, "Would you treat your own mother like that?" The question didn't land like a punch. It landed like a mirror, and that's what cracked Grant's shell. Because it wasn't rhetorical, it wasn't weaponized, it was real. And in that moment, he realized the answer wasn't just no. It was not even close. "I didn't mean," Grant started, then stopped. His voice caught in the middle, too full of self-protection to be honest. Too full of shame to keep spinning the script. "I didn't mean to disrespect her." Shaq exhaled. "Slow. But you did." Grant nodded once. "I know." Silence again, and then Shaq walked to the window, peering through the blinds, watching the crowd outside. They hadn't moved. Still standing, still waiting. Not for outrage, not for revenge, just for truth, for accountability that didn't come with press releases. "You know what's worse than racism?" Shaq said, not turning around. "The kind that's polite. The kind that smiles and says, 'Yes, ma'am,' while still assuming you're less. That's what she's been living with her whole life. And you added to that. You didn't swing a baton. You didn't shout, but you made her smaller. You made her prove she belonged. And that cuts deeper than any slow." Grant sank back into his chair. His shoulders sagged under the weight of it. Shaq turned back, walking slowly to the desk. "Do you know why she didn't say my name?" Grant shook his head. "Because she doesn't think fame should be a passport to dignity. Because she wanted to see who you were when you thought she was nobody. And now you know what she saw." Grant dropped his eyes. "I saw what I was taught to see." Shaq's eyebrows raised slightly. "Then unlearn it." There was no rage in his voice. No threat. Just instruction. Like a father talking to a son too old to make the same excuses. In that moment, Grant wasn't looking at an NBA Hall of Famer. He was looking at a man standing in defense of the only woman who ever taught him how to be one. And the fact that it wasn't louder, that it wasn't filmed, that it wasn't broadcast, that made it land harder. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and placed it on the desk. "That's the name of a community group in this city. They do workshops, real ones. No cameras, no PR. You want to make this right, you start there. Not with a press conference, with perspective." Grant stared at the paper. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" Shaq met his eyes. "It ain't about her forgiveness. It's about your awareness." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "One more thing." Grant looked up. Next time you stop someone and don't know who they are, assume they matter. Always. And with that, Shaquille O'Neal stepped back into the hallway, his footsteps quiet, his back straight, the space behind him forever changed. Outside, the sun was starting to dip, shadows stretching long over the sidewalk. The crowd still stood, calm but resolved, watching every exit, waiting for something. Not a verdict, not a headline, just a sign that someone inside had finally heard them. When the door opened and Shaq emerged, no one cheered, no one shouted. They just parted, making room for him to walk through, unbothered, unbowed. The camera flashes were held back, phones raised but silent, because they knew what they were witnessing wasn't a moment of celebrity. It was a moment of accountability, and it had walked out on its own 2 feet. The room was smaller than he expected. No podiums, no whiteboards, just a circle of mismatched chairs, and about 10 people. All men, black and white, Latino and biracial, dressed in work clothes, security uniforms, faded hoodie. The man leading the session was mid-60s, lean, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look past pretense. "Grant," the man said, offering a handshake without ceremony. "We don't do speeches here. We do honesty. That cool with you?" Grant nodded, nervousness tightening around his ribs. He took a seat. For the first 20 minutes, he said nothing. Just listened. Listened to a retired firefighter talk about being pulled over in front of his daughter's school. Listened to a delivery driver talk about being mistaken for a suspect just because he matched a vague description. Listened to a young man describe the fear in his mother's eyes when cops followed them home. Not with lights, just with presence. Then it was his turn. He cleared his throat, his voice scratchy from disuse. "I stopped a woman the other day. Thought she was being evasive. Turns out, she was Shaquille O'Neal's mother." No one gasped. No one rolled eyes. They just waited. Grant looked down, then back up. "I didn't recognize her. But even if I had, it wouldn't have mattered. I didn't treat her wrong because I didn't know who she was. I treated her wrong because I assumed she wasn't someone worth treating right." That line hung in the room like fog. He continued, slower now. "I told myself I was following the rules. I wasn't. I was following bias I never bothered to question. And I don't want to be that kind of man anymore." The facilitator nodded once. "Then don't be." Simple words, but heavy ones. Grant came back the next week, and the next. And soon, it wasn't about that one stop. It was about his entire perception. How he saw teenagers with hoodies. How he clutched assumptions when he walked into certain neighborhoods. How he viewed compliance as a moral barometer. He didn't always speak, but he always listened. And slowly, the badge on his chest began to mean something different. Not because of what it gave him, but because of what it demanded from him. Word of his attendance got around. Not from him, but from others. Some praised it. Others mocked it. A few called it performative. But the truth was quieter than all of that. He was changing. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But honestly. The department didn't announce anything. There was no press release. But internally, Captain Morris had taken notice. He watched Grant more closely during briefings, listened to how he spoke to new recruits, how his language changed, less defensive, more curious. One afternoon, Grant walked into Morris's office and asked if he could help design a new training module, something beyond the check-the-box bias seminars, something built around dialogue. Morris looked at him, measured. "Why now?" Grant didn't flinch. "Because I spent years protecting the badge from accountability. I want to help make sure the badge learns how to carry it instead." And so, the shift began. Quietly, internally. Not to erase what had happened, but to grow from it. Because that's what accountability really is. It's not punishment, it's permission. To change, to evolve, to acknowledge harm without being defined by it. The irony wasn't lost on Grant. It had taken a stop that should have been simple to force him to confront truths that weren't. And the woman who triggered his growth, she never even raised her voice. She just held her ground. Weeks later, he wrote her a letter. Not to clear his conscience, but to express gratitude. He didn't mail it. He left it at the community center, where someone said they'd make sure it got to her. In it he wrote, "You didn't ask for a lesson to be learned, Miss O'Neal. But you taught one anyway. Not with power, but with presence. Not with outrage, but with dignity. And if I'm a better man 5 years from now, it'll be because of what I learned standing in front of your stillness." Sometimes, the real badge ain't what's pinned to your chest. It's what you're willing to face when no one's forcing you to. It didn't go viral because he cried. It went viral because he changed. The auditorium at Briarfield College wasn't built for moments like this. It was small, practical, a space normally used for student forums, mock trials, and underattended lectures. But today, it held more than bodies. It held weight. Every seat was filled, not by press or politicians, but by people. Mothers, elders, young students with notebooks on their laps, and eyes sharper than any reporter's pen. At the edge of the stage stood Raina, holding a clipboard that had long since stopped being useful. Her fingers trembled just slightly, not from nerves, but from knowing how close she'd come to not recording that video. One missed turn, one skipped red light, and none of this would have happened. The podium was plain. No backdrop, no campaign banner, no police flag, just a single mic, and the unmistakable tension of a city holding its breath. Officer Grant Wilmer stepped up alone. No chief beside him. No PR agent. Just his badge pinned to a simple gray blazer, and his eyes locked on the audience. No paper in his hands. No teleprompter behind him. He had rehearsed nothing. Intentionally, because sometimes words don't need polish. They just need truth. He adjusted the mic and began. I didn't come here to explain what I did. I came to own it. The room stayed silent, even as cell phones rose, blinking red, quietly recording history. When I stopped Lucille O'Neill, on that road, I thought I was doing my job. That's what I told myself. I followed procedure. I ran her license. I stayed within the lines. But what I didn't do was see her. I didn't see the human being in front of me. I saw a stereotype, and I didn't even know it, because it's the kind of thing you don't see until someone holds up a mirror. He paused, swallowed. I didn't recognize her name that day, but that's not the part I regret. I regret that I needed a name to start treating her with the dignity she already deserved. And if I hadn't been challenged, if I hadn't been forced to look at myself, I would have kept walking that same blind path. His voice cracked slightly, but he steadied it. This isn't just about Ms. O'Neill. It's about every mother who's ever had to answer questions that shouldn't have been asked. Every woman who's been forced to stay calm so someone in a badge didn't escalate things. Every elder who's had to smile through suspicion just to make it home. I saw myself as the authority that day. But the truth is, she had more authority in her silence than I had in my badge. Gasps didn't follow. Just stillness. Like the air had thickened. In the past month, I've been doing something I should have done a long time ago. Listening. Sitting in rooms without uniforms. Without titles. Learning what I was too proud or too afraid to admit. And I know now that accountability isn't something you run from. It's something you walk toward. He turned slightly, searching the front row. When he saw her, the tremor in his jaw deepened. Lucille O'Neill sat poised, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the same composure she carried during the stop, the same dignity that had anchored this entire story. She wore a soft blue blouse, simple earrings, and a gaze that held firm but not bitter, watching him, not judging, not condoning, just witnessing. I disrespected you, Miss O'Neill, Grant said. Not just with words, but with posture, with tone, with everything I didn't say but implied. And I am sorry. Truly. I can't erase what I did, but I can promise that your grace has changed the way I wear this badge. And I'll spend the rest of my time in this uniform proving that change is real. He stepped back, the mic dipping slightly. Then he did something unexpected. He removed the badge from his chest, held it in both hands, and placed it gently on the podium. Not as a resignation, but as a gesture. This badge has to earn back trust. Starting with me. The room erupted in silence. Lucille rose slowly from her seat. Not rushed. Not rehearsed. Just calm and assured. She walked up the short steps and stood beside him. She didn't reach for the mic. She didn't touch his shoulder. She just looked at him, eye to eye, and then she nodded once. Not a nod of approval, not forgiveness wrapped in a bow. Just a nod that said, I see you. I believe you mean it. And now it's on you to live it. Then she turned to the crowd. Some people asked me why I didn't say his name that day. She said softly, why I didn't tell that officer who my son was. And the truth is simple, I shouldn't have had to. My name should have been enough. Heads nodded throughout the auditorium. Some lowered, others lifted. And I didn't come here to demand justice. Lucille continued. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. And it only moves when people are willing to see themselves as part of the problem and the solution. She paused, then added with quiet finality. This young man just took a step. It's not the end, but it matters. The applause started small, then rose like rain tapping louder on glass, growing steady and strong, not thunderous but heartfelt. Later at the back of the auditorium, Raina stood with her phone off, eyes wet, clipboard pressed to her chest. She had started all this without knowing it. She'd just recorded what she saw, and now, somehow, she had helped shift the course of something that once felt immovable. A professor patted her shoulder gently. She didn't need the credit. She already knew what her camera had captured. It had caught a crack, and then a light through it. After the event, Shaq stood outside, away from the crowd. He hadn't taken the mic. He hadn't walked on stage. He didn't need to. His presence had already done its part. But a journalist did catch up to him, recorder in hand, asking the obvious question, "Mr. O'Neill, what's your take on today's apology?" He looked over his sunglasses, calm, then said, "Power's not what you flex, it's what you protect." Then he walked away. And that was the quote that made the evening headlines. The video of the apology hit 5 million views by midnight. But no hashtags this time, no slogans, just one clip of a man standing in front of a room, taking off his badge, and saying, "I was wrong." It didn't go viral because he broke down. It went viral because he stood up. That clip, the one that circled the nation, then the globe, was captured by a student who almost didn't pull over. Raina James now walks the stage at her college commencement in a deep green gown, her name echoing through the crowd as she accepts a National Journalism Award. Not for the number of views, not for the press, but for the truth she caught without narration, without staging, truth framed in silence and restraint. Her thesis, titled The Power of Witness, now sits on the desk of a media professor who says it's required reading. Raina didn't ask for attention. She didn't chase the story. But she followed her instincts, and that instinct changed her path. She's already lined up for a fellowship with a civil rights watchdog agency. Her job, investigating digital evidence of civil misconduct. Her tools, a phone, a steady hand, and a voice she now knows how to use. Shaquille, meanwhile, keeps his own reflections private. He didn't go on a tour, didn't build a brand around the moment, but he did do something he'd never done before. He narrated a short film produced by a nonprofit, one that told the story not of fame, but of motherhood, of black women and the quiet battles they face just getting from one side of town to another. In the voiceover, his words cut deeper than any highlight reel ever did. "Some folks think power is how hard you hit, but my mama taught me, it's how steady you stand when they try to make you sit down." The short film aired on public access first, then was picked up by a national channel. But the most shared clip wasn't his monologue. It was a single frame of Lucille, walking alone through a grocery store, purse over her shoulder, unbothered and unescorted. The image said everything. You don't need to be protected when you are the strength. And as for Officer Grant Wilmer, he did something nobody expected. He left. Not in disgrace, not under pressure. He turned in his badge 2 months after the apology, submitted a letter that was neither bitter nor apologetic. In it he wrote that the badge no longer felt like something he could wear honestly. Not because he hated it, but because he finally respected what it should stand for. He didn't vanish. He didn't disappear into anonymity. He shifted. The following fall, he joined a nonprofit that focuses on bridging police departments and communities through equity forums and long-form listening sessions. He doesn't sit at the front of the room. He pours coffee, carries chairs, shares stories when asked. And when young officers roll their eyes at the word bias, he doesn't lecture. He just says, "Let me tell you about Lucille." He doesn't say O'Neill. He doesn't need to. And Lucille? She stays out of interviews, declines podcasts, never once posts about the event on her social media. When asked in church how she feels about the attention, she smiles and says, "God already saw it before y'all did." The women in her prayer circle nod, not because they understand fame, but because they understand grace under pressure. She never stopped being who she was. She didn't reinvent herself to match the story the world wrote. She let the world catch up to the truth she always knew. She mattered before they noticed. On a quiet morning, just after sunrise, Lucille walks the length of her driveway to collect a paper. It's nothing dramatic, just a slow walk in slippers, the way she's done for years. But a car drives by, slows down. A teenage girl in the passenger seat looks out the window. Her mother leans over and whispers, "That's the woman I told you about." The girl doesn't take a photo. She just waves. Lucille nods in return, soft but certain. That wave, that's the new kind of monument. One built not in stone, but in remembrance. Inside her house, the kettle hisses. She pours tea, sets it beside a copy of A Seat at the Table. Her own book still in print after all these years. She marks her place with a church program from the week before. There's a quote underlined at the top. Some stories aren't about who has power. They're about who has the courage to use it right. She leans back in her chair and watches the morning roll in through the blinds. It's the same sun, the same sky, the same road beyond her porch. But it's never looked more hers. Some stories don't end, they ripple. If you believe dignity should never depend on who you are, stay close. The next story is already unfolding, and the ones who listen first are the ones who lead next. Keep watching, keep feeling, keep standing.